two people can use the same tool, but one of them might have dramatically different results because of their personal practice that brings a level of presence to them.
Hello and welcome to the Days of Change podcast. Today we will be talking about the power of stories and about what facilitators can do to provide and hold spaces for innovation and change. Mary Alice Arthur will be with me and I'm going to introduce her in just a moment. But before I do that, let me briefly reflect what this is all about. I'm really excited about this podcast. We have a lot of wonderful guests on the show. Recently, I talked to Julie Diamond on the issue of power. And in another recent show, I had a great conversation with Sue Knight on provocation as a coaching tool. If you haven't listened to those shows and all the others before, I can highly recommend them. What a bunch of different topics have we covered over the last 3 months. We talked about how applied improv can save the world, or how company structures need to change according to the requirements of the 21st century. For me, Celine Schillinger nailed it down in the second episode where she said, people don't want to be told anymore. You can find all the links to all episodes and the show notes on changedays.com/podcast. Yes, there are fundamental changes going on in our societies and also in our organizations. And that is what the Days of Change podcast is all about. I'm talking to people who all have one thing in common. They are courageous in the way they live their lives. They're open for change themselves and they help others to reflect. As a matter of principle, I've met all the people I invite before at one of our great events, the Berlin or Toronto Change Days. Those are annual fora in which change aficionados meet, network, learn and celebrate, or they are in-house events in organizations with the goal of kicking off a transformation process. If you want to know more, please go to our website, which is changedays.com, and join us in one of our events. We might talk more about this later on because my guest of today is one of the close friends connected to our community. What shall I say about her? She is one of the persons who, if you have seen her for 2 or 3 minutes, you will never forget her. She leaves an impression on anybody, and by that she polarizes because not everybody can deal with the enormous energy that she transmits and the passion with which she shares her message. Some people call her a magician. She calls herself a story activist. I haven't met anybody like her, and I will try to approach this special human being in this show carefully. Mary Alice Arthur was born in Indiana, but she has spent quite some time of her life in New Zealand and in other parts, for example, in Europe. She's one of the leading teachers on the art of hosting and also of the storytelling movement, and we'll try to make a connection between the two fields. Mary Alice, it is an honor to having you on this show today. I deeply admire you and the way you demonstrate and spearhead our craft. Very warm welcome.
Thanks so much, Olga. Delighted to be with you.
From where do you join us today?
I'm sitting in Ohio. I live in Columbus, Ohio at the moment, and so under an overcast but slightly blue sky. I'm waving to you, although you can't see me.
You are really wandering between the worlds, or you have wandered between the worlds, and you called yourself one time an intentional nomad.
Yeah.
It seems that you are one of those people who never settle down, or do you now? You travel all the time. How are you keeping up?
Well, I blame my father actually for the fact that I have what they would call an itchy foot. So I'm somebody who actually learns through traveling, and I've always found myself very stimulated by being in different cultures and different places, and I think that's been true through my career in facilitation, which is now more than 25 years in motion. I like being behind the scenes and seeing different things, and so even if I'm living somewhere, I guarantee you I'll never hang up my suitcase.
So which were some of the stations I mentioned already in New Zealand? What did you do there? And then I think you lived in Denmark for a while.
Yep. Everything started out really when my mother introduced me to somebody who'd been an exchange student in Japan when I was 16. And I was so amazed by this story. You know, in the 70s, nobody knew about sushi. It's been all over the planet now, but where I was living in the middle of Indiana, which is kind of in the middle of a cornfield, nobody had heard of sushi. And Rob said all this wonderful stuff about his experience. And then he said, and you could go to Japan too. Don't worry, none of the clothes would fit you, but they'll build you something. So intrigued by that I immediately tried to become an exchange student, which finally worked out at age 17. And that kind of set my trajectory for life. And I was in Germany for a year. Came back to my university. They had a junior year abroad program, spent another year at the University of Hamburg, which is why I still speak German, I think, now. And then I joined a student organization, which kind of had an outlet all over the world, ISEC. And that's how I ended up in Brussels, which is then how I ended up in New Zealand at the time.
Okay.
So I went there for a traineeship with Ogilvy and Mather Advertising. That was why I originally went. And then I kind of didn't leave. So I stayed and became a New Zealand citizen. So I'm still a dual passport holder, although I'm wishing for more. I spent a lot of time traveling out of my suitcase, some years living in the suitcase almost, and then 2 years in Denmark. I came back to the States beginning of 2017, which is 35 years outside of my own country. Right. You can imagine the culture shock.
I can. As I said in my introduction, you are a special person. You are sometimes polarizing. I really love that. One thing nobody can deny is your breathtaking presence. There are few people who have this magic gift of drawing people into the field. How did that gift develop over your lifetime, and when did you become aware of it? Were there early signs in your childhood that indicated that you would become the person who you are today?
I was thinking about that just recently, since my mother died and her funeral was just recently. And in speaking about her, I realized that she was my first role model as a listener and as a story catcher. She must have held, I mean, when I went to New Zealand, I said, oh, wow, thank goodness nobody knows my mom here. Because when I was growing up, it felt like she knew everybody and everybody knew her. And she had this way of catching and holding stories of all these different people. And so I think she was my first role model. And if I think about myself being in groups, then I have to look back to being part of the Girl Scouting movement, where you work in teams. And that's something I did from quite early on. So I actually realized, wow, I've been in groups since I was about 8. It's actually a long, long trajectory. So those things. And then when I did finally catch up with storytelling, or it caught up with me when I was in my 30s, I realized that I love stories and my whole system is attuned to them. And when you learn how to tell stories, there's something I don't know what it's called, but I call it the resonant voice. There's something, when somebody is actually good at telling stories, there's a way that they kind of get you on the train and you stay on the train with them. There is a magnetism that comes from that way of speaking and relating to the spoken word.
I wonder how one can learn to become a good storyteller. I consider myself as quite a mediocre one, not a good one, not a bad one, but definitely far away from people like you or many other people I've met on my way. So how can one become a good storyteller?
First of all, you just need to listen to as many stories as possible. It's like I heard one time of a guy who was studying the Russian language, and he wondered about why some people could learn it well and some couldn't. And he found out that this is how the brain works. That if you immerse the brain in as much of the material you're trying to learn as possible, it begins to make the kind of connections that make learning that possible, right? So if you want to learn a language and you start listening to radio programs or TV programs or people speaking in that language, even if you don't understand it, then those synapses start forming. And I actually heard somewhere that children are like this. You can speak any language to a child and they will begin to learn it. But at a certain point in time in your life, the brain makes a decision. Do I need to know this going on from now or not? So if you had somebody speaking to you in German for 5 days a week and somebody coming in only once a week speaking another language, your brain would opt for German. But the possibility is there to learn all of those things.
That's interesting because I actually learned Russian quite for some years, and I learned Spanish. And I forgot all of my Russian, but I still speak reasonable Spanish. And probably this is the secret behind. How does that apply to storytelling then?
The same thing, you know. So if you listen to a podcast like This American Life is well known, or The Moth, or any of those kind of programs where people are regularly telling stories, TED Talks are a good one for that. Because if a TED Talk is any good, there's a story in it.
Right.
Like, you never watch a TED Talk and go, wow, I'm so amazed by that data. I just want more data. You know, you go, wow, that was an amazing story, and that helps me remember the data. So if you think about the, you know, for example, TED Talk that really lit your lights, you know, the one that you really went, wow, that's amazing. So if I take, for example, Brene Brown, I watched one of hers just recently. Right. She's now got a special on Netflix.
Yeah,
and she is very good at, and you notice then, very good at weaving stories in as she's talking, and then bringing up her data points about why she knows that that is true or not. Mm-hmm. About why people are courageous, or why they can be vulnerable, or what difference it makes. And that makes the information stick with you. So the more you listen to somebody who's really good at story and go, okay, what did they do? How did they do that, right? Because a story actually has a very simple spine. It's got a beginning and an end. We know that. And why does it have a beginning and an end? Because life goes on like this amazing river. And, you know, it's like being on a grade 5, a river, trying to river raft, you know, wow, what was that? And you don't have time to stop. So I think that's why humans invented stories, so they could stop for a moment and have a look at a segment of time and make sense and meaning of it, and therefore have some sense that there was sense and meaning. So you need a beginning, you need an end, you need some kind of characters. Like, we're more interested in stories about characters than anything else, but we're pretty good at making things into characters. Like the dragon in The Hobbit is a character. It's not just a amorphous other thing. And then there needs to be some kind of challenge or some pithy moment where things aren't going quite as you expected. And then there needs to be some kind of resolution, although that doesn't mean there has to be a happy end.
It needs to be emotional, isn't it?
Yes, there needs to be what some people call LOTS, L-O-T-S, language of the senses. So help me see it, help me be in it, help me feel it. And when I have those things, when it's not business as usual, we don't pay much attention to stories that are business as usual, because we kind of go, yeah, never mind about that. Because our brain is really interested in learning stuff. So we're wired to listen for things that are interesting and unusual.
Why do you think storytelling has become something like a fashion or a trend in the business coaching industry? I mean, you didn't hear much about storytelling, let's say 10 years ago, but suddenly there is a lot of things being offered about storytelling. There are a lot of people there. There's the great conference Beyond Storytelling in Germany going on every year. So what made it that suddenly everybody's talking about storytelling, particularly in business?
I think you're right. I say story is the new black. So to take the fashion metaphor.
Okay. Yeah.
And, you know, interestingly enough, I first went to my first storytelling festival in '92. This trend actually began in the '70s. And there was a book called Megatrends, John Nesbitt and Patricia Aberdeen, who are future trendsetters or future forecasters. And one of their trends was high tech, high touch. They wrote this book in 1983. I don't remember the other ones, but I remember that one, because I believe the rise of personal computers and the rise of storytelling began to happen at the same time. These were both in the '70s. We had kind of storytelling festivals coming up in the UK and the US, and Steve Jobs and the other Steve were on it. And, you know, and the other guys, everybody was on it, on the personal computers.
Right.
But I think why it's really come into its own now. And, you know, where I first started hearing about storytelling in organizations was 2003, interestingly enough. So I was out in the fresh green field with a few other early adopters. We were like, hey, why doesn't anybody else know about this? But I think it's because that first wave, what I call the first wave of storytelling, is really prevalent right now. It's like a tsunami. And that wave is about influence. So business leaders want to have influence. They want to tell a better story so people understand what they're trying to do, so people trust them in their leadership, so people see a flag waving in kind of a foggy future in a complex present. They are looking to help set the pace and hoping that people will follow them. So this is the wave of influence, and I think it's really big right now.
it's certainly not a coincidence that this comes at the same time where everybody is talking again about cultural change. So my big question is, and I have some clients I'm thinking about very specifically, in a company which exists for a while, whether it's 10 years or 30 or 40 years, 10 years is already a long time, certain stories are already ingrained in the history. They are told and told again. So if such a company wants to change the stories, how would that work?
Well, so I said the first wave is influence. I think the second wave of story is collective sense and meaning making, which is a lot of the work I do. How do you work with stories to find out what gold is in them and what other things are in those stories that you haven't seen before? Because you've already decided this is the meaning. Like, I've got this square box. I've got the gift box. I'm going to open the gift box and, hey, look, here's the meaning. But if you listen to my story with a different set of ears, then you can help me to see that there's other meaning and other wisdom and other gold I can take out of this story. So I've done a lot of work with how do you work with the stories that are already in place and use an amount of targeted harvesting arcs or ways of listening to the story that will help you to see it in a different way. And what happens then when you do is that you become a collective field that actually has meaning at the center of it that can work in a different way. So you can look at the kind of stories, and I'm thinking about a children's charity I worked with in New Zealand called Bernardo's. It's the largest children's charity. It came out of Ireland at a time in the Victorian age when a lot of kids were living on the streets and were being abused and harried and stuff like that. So they had told their story in a particular way. And when you have a founder, like a charismatic founder, which is where a lot of organizations come from, the Walmarts of this world, or IKEA is a prime example. Well, IKEA is interesting because he wasn't so charismatic, but deeply valued.
Right.
Very deep set of values and how things should run, and was really a personalized kind of guiding force in that organization. So it's interesting to say what's going to happen now that he died. So what happens when we take the stories we know and love and we look at them from different angles? I did that for two or more years in Denmark. We looked at the story of Denmark going bankrupt in 1813 and how that fundamentally put universal education, which came in 1814, and the golden age of Denmark and what Denmark is today. How did that all come out of that particular time period? And interestingly enough, no historians had picked up that period at all. They had all studied the golden age.
Yeah, it sounds to me that takes a long time, or is it? I remember one of the first generation authors on appreciative inquiry, Bernard Moore, subtitled one of his books on appreciative inquiry with change at the speed of imagination. And of course, with the age of agility, which we also have at the same time now, everybody calls for speed, but the process you were just describing sounds to me that it takes time.
Any good deep listening and shifting of stuff takes time, you know. So we as consultants, you know how organizations just hate hearing change is going to take at least 2 to 3 years, don't they? They really hate that. But actually, if you really want to bed it in, it takes about that long to kind of formally, but the beginning of something can be very fast. Seeing something. And appreciative inquiry, I would call a story methodology. They don't call themselves that. But actually at the heart of appreciative inquiry is story sharing and kind of combing through the threads of what are the root causes and what can we learn about where we've been at our best. And if we kept going in that direction, if we tried being our best more often, what would happen, right?
Right.
So story is the same. A collective story harvest, for me, minimum time you can really spend on it is about 90 minutes. But you can learn a heck of a lot in 90 minutes and begin uncovering more things. In Art of Hosting, because we love that concept of harvesting, we do hosting and harvesting. Like if you're going to have a meeting, what are you having a meeting for if you're not going to take something out of it, right?
Yeah.
So there is what we call the river beneath the river. In other words, if you comb through something and then you let it sit for a moment and then you bring other people in to look at it, you will see different patterns in the material you gathered than you maybe did before.
And I'll come to the art of hosting in just a moment. I just have one question before, because obviously if you are a storyteller, you talk. I mean, you talk when you tell stories, but I hear from you a lot between the lines that storytelling is also about questioning. And you said in your TED Talk, by the way, which I didn't mention so far, there is a great TED Talk with a lot of stories by Mary Alice. And you said there that we have a low question literacy in our world. I would
Yes.
fully agree with you about that. There is this notion between advocacy and inquiry, which Rick Ross and Charlotte Roberts described in Peterson J. Fifth's Discipline Field book. By the way, that's another early source of mine, which defines my graph today. So how does storytelling, which sounds to me is the advocacy part, go together with questioning?
Well, that's it, because if you think of a yin yang, if you picture a yin yang in your head, there's a few things that can go into the yin yang. And a yin yang looks like two different things sitting together.
Right.
But actually it's more than that, because it is both those things and the interaction and practice of those things together. So it's at least three things, if not more. So in that yin yang, you could picture that story and listening are together. So everybody thinks the storyteller has the power, but actually listeners have an incredible power for shaping a story. How you listen. I always say you can listen a better story out of someone with the quality of your listening than they ever expected. So that kind of quality of presence that you bring is amazingly important. But also you could put in the yin yang storytelling and story work. So as a leader, how do you tell a good story? Because people are looking to leaders to say, hey, where are we going? What is the vision? Like if I would think of when I think of the average organizational survey results, I think they usually sound like this. I love my team and I love my work. What the heck are the senior management doing? I can't tell that they're doing anything. We have terrible communication. And what are all the rest of you doing?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly the results of every survey I've seen so far. You're right.
And
fantastic.
Often people say we have terrible communication because they don't know how to say, I'm not getting what I need, but I don't know what it is.
Yeah. Wow. That's
for some people, terrible communication can be like, hey, that's too much. And other people can go, hey, that's not enough. And then there are the third bunch of people who go, I cannot tell how what I'm doing fits into the organizational future. Do I matter? And is anybody paying attention? Yeah. And all of those get lumped under, we have terrible communication. And an HR person would say all of those things impact on line of sight. Line of sight meaning, do I see how my bit is important to the whole, and is my bit valued? So I've realized over time, working with groups over years, people don't want just participation. They want contribution.
Right.
I want to know that my bit matters. So a leader needs to know how to tell a good story, but they also need to work with the stories that are already inherently in the system to say, which of these are generative and which of these are not? Yeah. So that's where story activism comes in. So the story activist, if I look at what does that mean to me, it means that I'm aware and I'm working with how stories work. And since all of us are humans, stories are working in us all the time, even if we don't think of ourselves as storytellers, because none of us hold what we know in data form. Most of us hold what we know is in story form. That's how you find it in the neural network. The activist part is, what stories are we choosing to activate because they are generative? They are taking us to a more fruitful, more thriving, more generative, more flourishing future. And at the same time, how do we work together well so that we can get to that future we can see through our stories?
Right. And I think this is a good opportunity now to do a little bit of advertising, because you will host a workshop on hosting brave and transformative spaces, and we are going into that topic right away. And I will host a workshop on deep listening all around the Berlin Change Days 2019.
Yes.
So if our listeners are interested to see and hear more of this great lady I have online here, and also learn something about listening and be part of the community of the Berlin Change Days, please check our website at berlinchangedays.com.
Yeah, and we'd love to see you there, right? Both because listening is so fantastic as a topic. I'm really into that. Yeah. And because, life is too short for boring meetings anymore, really.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I had a fantastic leader in a webinar this week who said, he is never calling for a meeting because he's just disturbing his teams with that. He uses the meetings his team already has, and then he goes in as a listener. So he tries not to interfere with the meetings which are going on. Isn't that fantastic?
What he's taking there, it's sounding like, just from the edge of what you're saying, is the move from hero to host.
Yes.
The move from, I've been so heroic and, I'm leading this team and everybody follow me, to how do I host people into their brilliance?
Yeah.
Because if they were doing their most brilliant self, then we would all be benefiting, the organization would be benefiting, we would be able to ride the waves of change we're talking about, because those are not stopping. We would be transformative in who we were being, enough to help influence those people who are connected to us to also be their brilliance.
And I think he has started to understand that. Great guy. His name is Conny Detloff. He works for a big online retailer. Anyhow, I want to move a little bit the topic to what you have mentioned already, to the art of hosting, and then a little bit later to brave and transformative spaces. And obviously this is connected. Most of our listeners will probably heard about the art of hosting, or many will have experienced it, either as participant or a practitioner. I have a personal story with large group facilitation approaches, which started in the 90s when open space technology hit me like a hammer. I mean, I had been a traditional, very control-oriented facilitator, and you know that I still a little bit of control freak, but I'm trying to mitigate that
in the nicest possible way, Holger.
Thank you very much. So then I had a community of practice where somebody mentioned open space technology. I just thought, whoa, I have to learn that. And I went with Harrison Owen, and then later with David Cooper Ryder, and then of course with the fantastic Marvin Weissport and Sandra Janov, all these great guys. So I learned a lot, and there are these principles which probably Harrison Owen summarized as providing and holding space as the role of a facilitator, and the best, of course, Marvin Weissport with the title of his fantastic book, which for me is the Bible of "Don't Just Do Something, Stand There."
I love that title.
Yeah, isn't that great? And the book is really, really good. I mean, I recommend it if somebody wants to read one book on facilitation. This is the book. Yeah. So that transformed me deeply. I'm not quite sure how art of hosting actually developed in this time period historically, and what is its place among the other approaches that I've mentioned.
So just before we go on, there's something Harrison Owen said I just really love, which is all of this work is about creating a bigger now. How do we stay in the present with each other and really lean in together instead of falling into the past or flying off into the future? And I really love that as a quote. So interestingly enough, the founders of Art of Hosting, and it was kind of a collaborative movement, all came together through Meg Wheatley's initiative from the Four Directions, and also the Pioneers of Change, kind of these amorphous groups. And at least Tokomola and Monica Nissan, who were part of those groups and are from Denmark, said to me, well, first of all, we learned, just like you did, open space, and we really loved it. And then Finn Voltoft, who was part of the beginning of World Cafe and was there when World Cafe was found. They call Juanita and David and Finn used to call themselves the finders, not the founders. Finn came back to Denmark from the US and told all about this new thing, and then Monica and Toka learned about that, and they said, it felt like we had a lover, and then we found this other lover, and we were two-timers. We couldn't figure out which one of them we loved better. And people can get a bit tied to whatever their methodology is. Right. Like I know that people who do open space all the time used to call themselves space nicks. I don't know what they call themselves now. Or there are people who think the answer to everything is World Cafe, or the answer to everything is appreciative inquiry. And Toka and Monica and those people, they just said, I wonder if it's possible to weave these different ways of participatory practice together in a way that will support a group to go through the movements that groups normally do and come out the other end for wiser action. Where do we use World Cafe? Where do we use open space? Where do we use appreciative inquiry? So those, and circle. So those were those are the core practices that began, because we know Juanita and David really well. They know Harrison. We know Christina Baldwin and Anne Linnea, who've been holding the Circle Way for all this time. All of those people knew each other. And all of those initiatives really were giving themselves to being open source, which is an amazing gift.
Yes.
So art of hosting really kind of came up in the early 2000s as, how do these things weave together? And the question at the core of it is, how do we host and harvest conversations that really matter? And how do we enable people who are not professional facilitators to have a grip on some methodologies and some practice that will help them host conversations wherever they are? So if we believe that conversation is the medium for transformation, and it seems to be that way, even if we're having a conversation with our own head. I mean, I'm a Gemini, so there's at least two of me. I don't need anyone else to be in the conversation. I'm already having one. Then if conversation is the medium for transformation, how do we make our conversations better so that we can actually come to the transformation we need and lean in when it gets hard instead of falling apart? So that's kind of the core. And it's been going since the early 2000s. At this moment on Facebook, I'd say we're at just about at 13,000 people, something like that. So it's been all over the world. It's being shared and worked with all over the world. And there is a kind of a loose, there's no organization, there's no headquarters, there's no logo. In fact, I heard somebody once say, if there's ever an art of hosting tea set, please shoot me. So it's an open source thing, which we're kind of holding together through practice and commitment and relationship.
Related to that, and let's not make many enemies out there, but what do you think about liberating structure as a kind of instant facilitation compendium?
I think it's a really interesting thing to pull together a lot of different ways of working and help them to be more accessible to people. I mean, in my own work, I'm thinking about that. I'm working with another colleague now on what we're calling the 5 powers. If we, both of us have been facilitators for more than 25 years, and we think, okay, if we strip away facilitators speak, if we strip away corporate jargon, if we strip away art of hosting, every group that works on something for a long time, any practice field develops its own language, right? So it's an interesting thing to say, how can we make some really fundamental stuff available to anyone so that all of us, this is like the question of question literacy. How do we up question literacy? How do we up the ability to host conversations that really matter with everyone? And, where does that go mainstream so that we all as a humanity can work on the complex things facing us better together? I'm most interested in practice. And that, in fact, is going to be what we look at in those 2 days. What are the practices? What are the participatory methods? And what are kind of the personal bit that underpins you being able to do the job you want to do to host brave and transformative spaces?
Hosting brave and transformative spaces. Mm-hmm. Do we need those spaces? Obviously, yes, of course. And why this title?
There is something that, it does take some amount of courage to trust in the collective. These are the days, we talked about the wave, the first wave of story, which is influence. And I said the second one is collective sense and meaning making. And I think the third one is healing and holding. In other words, bringing the fragments back together. And it's a brave thing to move away from, there should be one really powerful leader. All of our political systems seem to still be oriented toward that, to say, actually, all of us are in this together. So it takes some courage to actually go, no, face-to-face is a powerful place, and we need to be brave enough to face some of the big emotions, some of the pain and hurt that are in our organizational structures and in our societal structures. It actually takes courage. So, we picked that word brave very categorically because it's needed. And also because, last year we talked about courage, didn't we, at the Berlin Change Days?
Oh, yes.
So I'm kind of bringing that thread with me because I felt like it was a really important conversation.
So what would people learn if they come to this seminar? 3
Ps. That idea of participation. Good participation doesn't happen usually without a strong container. And what do we mean by that? The easiest way I know how to describe what a container is if you think about people drinking tea. There are some people in the world who drink tea out of a saucer. Not many, but there's some. Then most people drink tea out of a cup. And then, of course, you have the teapot. Now, if you're walking across the floor with a teapot in one hand and a cup of tea in the other hand, and you trip, then most likely some of the tea is going to fly out of the teacup. It's just not a container that's made for a lot of turbulence. But a teapot, because it has a lid on it and because of the construction of it, is made to take some turbulence and keep most of the tea inside. So when you think about groups, you think about the same thing. People talk a lot about there should be safe space, but actually there's no such thing really as safe space for everybody, but there is such a thing as safe enough space. So how do we create the kind of spaces where people are willing to be vulnerable, willing to share their stories, willing to be curious rather than in I wonder rather than I know? That's a really interesting inquiry. What does it mean to create a space where courage and vulnerability can show up? Because that's where you get innovation from. If those two things aren't present, there isn't going to be any innovation. So we have a lot of organizations that talk a good line about innovation, but then when people want to do something that's slightly out of the ordinary, the control mechanism pops up and stops it. So they talk about innovation, but they never get any, and then they wonder why. So that first bit about participation. The second bit about process. So what is the balance of hosting and harvesting? How do you make sure that you are using the kind of processes that help people be in interaction with each other? And how do you then gather the wisdom that comes out of those things? How do you be aware of both of those? And in Art of Hosting, we talk about be sure of what you want to harvest before you set the process methodology. And then the third one is about practice. Like, what is your practice? You cannot say you're a practitioner if you're not in ongoing practice. So if you just have the tools, every tool is resting in the bed of your practice. And two people can use the same tool, but one of them might have dramatically different results because of their personal practice that brings a level of presence to them or a level of depth to them that encourages something to come forward that the other person cannot even imagine. So those are the three things we want to look at.
Sounds great. I'm really looking forward to that. Mary Alice, what's up for you? I know that in the last 12 months you have hosted large online meetings. That was really fantastic. So what are your plans for the next months besides coming to Berlin?
Well, the Story the Future and storythefuture.com, you can have a look at the work we're doing there to actually really hold that inquiry alive of what is the future story of story, given that we're in that time of influence. And that means we're also on the cusp of people manipulating story in ways that's not so helpful in the world. How do we actually keep the inquiry on keeping the integrity and courageous nature of story alive? So we are working on our next iteration for that right now, which we're thinking about, called Story the Future Live, which will hopefully be a live feed for 3 or more days of story around the world. So that's that initiative. I have finished the text of a book called 365 Alive, which is how do you spend a year really delving deeply with a monthly task into your own personal story and how a story works. And now I'm in that stage of, okay, what's this going to look like and how does it get designed and onto the page? And then the other big thing is that the 5 powers, writing a book about that. And we think the 5 powers, the two of us, are appreciation, story, questions, invitation, and hosting. So if we look at those 5 things, how do they work in your life and in your work and in the world in ways that can help you to make a significant impact? So those are a few of the things on my list.
Mary Alice, I'll ask my guest regularly for a little tool, or what I call a little gift, something which our listeners can apply right away tomorrow at work or family or whatever they're doing. Do you have something in mind?
Yep, I really think the strongest tool that's there for everyone and one that deserves attention and good practice is the power of questioning. So questions are an incredible tool, and they are already an intervention in a system. So the moment you ask a question, you are in fact intervening in the system. So 2 stories to go into that first, and then maybe a question that might be useful. But the first one is a colleague who was a coach for people wanting to get executive positions. So she was a kind of an employment coach, and she had a person that she coached, and he got a senior role, much to his surprise and much to her surprise, actually. And she said to him, here's my advice to you. Spend the first week doing nothing else but asking this one question: what's working around here? So I don't know if she knew about appreciative inquiry, but that would, for me, kind of is in the appreciative inquiry camp, that kind of question, right. What's working around here? So he spent the first week asking this question. And it was interesting. He said that he reported back to her that the team grapevine went something like this: hey, have you met the new guy? He's really interested in what we think. So a really beautiful and powerful energy to come in with as a new leader, actually. And, all you have to do is ask the question and listen, but you're going to learn an awful lot, and you're going to learn about which ways you could help things move to get more of what you want to have that's working. So powerful. The second one was a time when I was in the end of a relationship, and I didn't quite know how to end it gracefully. I was much younger then. And I went to a party one night with the person I was with, and this other woman listened to him. He was in another room, and we could hear his voice kind of coming out of that room. And she listened I could tell she was listening very carefully. And then she fixed me with her eyes. Kind of how a snake fixes you with her eyes. I felt a bit like that in a moment. Uh-oh, what's coming? Right? Oh, and she says to me, I've been listening to him for quite some time. I can tell he's done a lot of work on himself, but I want to ask you this question. Is this a relationship or an entanglement? Oh my goodness, lightning struck me. If you can imagine me, I don't know how hard you have to imagine with my mouth open, kind of gobsmacked at that moment, but it gave me immense clarity because I immediately knew the answer. That was a demonstration of somebody listening really carefully and then allowing kind of the question to arise that needed to be asked in that moment. But I could tell she was a person who had some finesse in that. So what my invitation to anyone listening is to say, why don't you play with the power of inquiry, at least for the next week, if not for the next month, and let yourself just be very intuitive with the kind of questions that might come to you to ask in the moment. And the first one of those might be this one: what question could change your life right now?
Mary Alice, I have a list of 70 questions in front of me. You don't know that list, but it always works fine. It's always fun. Give me a number between 1 and 70.
31.
What do you wish your brain was better at doing?
I once met somebody who is incredibly good at multi-tracking. So simultaneously, while listening to somebody, she could also be kind of parallel processing many things at once and then go, okay, here's the answer. Here's what I'm going to do. Well, here's what I say to you. And I was amazed at that. So I'm not a single tracker. I can do more things at once, but the ability to actually hold all of that simultaneously and almost have a photographic memory on what somebody has said, man, I wish I had that.
As one of the books that had a great impact on you, you mentioned Momo by Michael Ende. In Germany, certainly one of the 100 most popular books of all time, but also internationally extremely successful and made into a movie. For those who don't know it, and I can't really imagine there's anybody out there, but maybe in the international audience, a few people, Momo is a girl who has the ability to listen, and by listening to make people find answers to their problems. In our words, she is a systemic coach at its best. It's also a parable on our use of time and consumerism and capitalism. So what influence had that book on you?
I like to say I met Momo when she was 12 and I was 24, and she's still 12. And I got given that book by a German exchange student. I got given it in German, so that I first read it in the original. And then I, in the meantime, also read it in English, and I've given it to a lot of people. But chapter 2 spends the entire chapter talking about her power of listening. In fact, it's called Listening. So the best, that one, and then there's one scene where Master Time takes her inside of her own heart, and she sees how, they're called the hour flowers, you know, how time ticks and there's one flower arising that is so beautiful, and then that flower begins to fade and the metronome goes across the other side and another flower arises even more beautiful. And that scene to me also is incredibly evocative of what the possibility is if you're incredibly present to what life offers. Because he says in this book, time is life and life is lived in the heart. So not only does she have the power of listening, but because of her intense power of presence, she kind of ends up saving the world. So there's something really beautiful about that ability to be present, to host people into their brilliance, to help the canary sing again, to help children invent play that they never knew they could do, and simply by being there and offering this amazing listening and deep presence. So she is my role model for listening, and has been since the moment I met her, and I can't think of a more powerful role model.
We do have a Spotify music playlist of our guests' suggestions, and I asked them to contribute some songs which are important to them. You, Mary Alice, said you don't listen to much music, but the music plays in your head. Well, okay, for a person like me who can't live without music, this is quite interesting and I mean, strange to meet somebody who doesn't listen to music. But you mentioned 2 songs. The one is John Farnham, You're the Voice. Of course, I knew it, but I wouldn't have been able to name the artist nor the title. That's a really nice one. And I looked up the lyrics today, and it says, we have the chance to turn the pages over. We can write what we want to write. Mm-hmm. And the other title you mentioned is Sarah Bareilles.
Sarah Bareilles.
Okay, it's Brave. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that song. I'm not sure. I couldn't remember it. And it says something similar. It says, you can be amazing. You can turn a phrase into a weapon or a drug. You can be the outcast. Do you want to talk about one or the 2 of the songs very briefly?
Yeah, the one, Brave, we used around our practice gathering for Art of Hosting when we were in Slovenia some years ago. And it was my love song to the group, to just say what you want to say. You know, I want to hear you be brave. So this is the moment, I think, that there's a question in the world. Number one, what is mine to do? This is a question that's been riding around with me for a long time, because people want you to do things. Lots of stuff is happening in the world, but what is mine to do is a big question. And then secondly, can I be brave enough to speak what I'm called to speak? Can I be brave enough to do what I'm called to do? You know, give me the courage. So this song is a little bit of a, yeah, you got it. I want to see you be brave.
Mary Alice, you honored the Berlin Change Days twice, and anybody who was there in 2018 will remember your co-facilitating what I described before, the way you draw people into the circle and make them do things they would usually not do at an event or a conference. So that was really remarkable. What is your observation of the Berlin Change Days? How would you describe it to somebody who has never been there?
It's a hotbed of change agents. And I'm meaning that in the nicest way, because I think what you have managed to achieve in these 10 years has been a real community of people who are not only determined to do their work in the world, but determined to support each other and cheer each other on and be a sounding board for each other. And all of us need that. So many of us as practitioners end up being the only person in the room with the group we're working with. And that can feel really lonely. I mean, that's how I found Art of Hosting to begin with, because I went, wow, I feel lonely as a practitioner and I can't improve my own practice by myself. You just keep doing the things you have found out to do and keep, polishing the diamond, but you don't extend your field without other people. And I think it's a really important place people can meet each other, can learn with each other, from and with each other, and can find their mates, people who are going to be at their back, who are going to be cheering them on. And those kind of places are gold, really, for those of us in our practice.
Mary Alice, it has been, as expected, such a pleasure talking to you. You're such a role model for me. I learn a lot from you, and thank you for taking your time, particularly after you had some hard time over the last weeks to cover. So thanks for being here, for spending an hour with me. It was an entertaining hour. I learned a lot, so keep going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Holger.